So you've been watching a good bit of New Heart Life, and you're sitting there thinking, okay, I'm getting it. Scripture clearly teaches a dichotomy of flesh and spirit, each with its own desire center. And so we have these desires that are produced by our material bodies that are set against those desires that are produced by our immaterial spirit or soul. And these desires compete with one another to keep us from doing the things that we want to do. But wait, you may ask, how can I tell the difference between a desire of the flesh and a desire of the spirit? It's great to know that these dueling desire centers exist, but how does it help me if I don't know which is which? Well, I am so glad you asked, because today we embark on a journey of understanding the desires of the flesh and the spirit. We'll explore how these dueling desire centers exist in the person and how to discern between them. Welcome to New Heart Life. I'm Kevin Laymon, and I'm a pastor and a biblical counselor in Wilmington, North Carolina. If this episode is helpful to you, it would mean so much to me if you would consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. I hope you enjoy the show. Rarely is the Christian ever moving throughout their day without experiencing the war of desire within them. Peter says our passions of the flesh are waging war against our soul. James wrote, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members?" Paul says, "For the desires of the flesh are against the spirit, and the desires of the spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do." Paul even acknowledged it in his own life. He says, "For I joyfully concur with the law of God in my inner man," right? "But I see a different law in my members, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a captive to the law of sin, which is in my members," or remember, in my body parts. And so for you and I, few passages should resonate with us to the degree that these passages do, because we feel it. We feel it all the time. We know what we want to do. We know what we should do. And yet we have this constant just nagging in the back of our mind and even sometimes at the forefront, trying to drag us in a different direction. When you feel that, that's the battle. That's the war. And Romans 8:13 says, "For if you are living according to the flesh, you must die. But if by the Spirit you are putting to death the practices of the body, you will live." So in the midst of this war that we feel all the time, we have to be able to put to death the practices, deeds, desires of the body. And the first step in doing that is being able to identify what's what. What does a desire of the flesh look like? What does a desire of the Spirit look like? And fortunately, we don't even have to guess, because Paul, the man responsible for bringing the dichotomy concept into full swing on the pages of Scripture, well, he loved lists. And if we go back to Galatians 5, where Paul introduces the dichotomy of flesh and spirit, we'll see that Paul gives us two lists right there in the context that describe the actions and attitudes that will proceed from the desires of the flesh and the desires of the spirit. It was so eye-opening to me the day I realized that these two lists are in connection to the explanation of the dichotomy. He literally presents the dichotomy and then says, this is what it will look like. So these lists are not arbitrary or standalone in the way and reason they show up in Scripture. Now, what do you guys and gals say we go ahead and get the bad news out of the way first? At least if we do that, we're following the same order that Paul did, because immediately after Paul discusses the flesh and spirit dichotomy in verses 16 to 18, he begins in verse 19, "The deeds of the flesh are evident." Now, keep in mind, these are deeds, not desires, that we're going to find in this list. These are actions you will take if you act on fleshly desires. So a bit of reverse engineering may have to be done when you find yourselves in the throes of temptation. And I'll talk about that here in a minute, but here's the list. Galatians 5:18 through 21. "But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. And the things like these is a general catch-all for anything that resembles any of these other deeds. Paul knew some of you. He knew there'd be some loophole hunters out there, and he's got you covered with the things like these. So we have here 15 deeds of the flesh listed, and maybe I'll do a video on each of them at some point, but I see, generally speaking, 4 categories of deeds. I see sexual sin, I see demon worship and witchcraft, there's sinful conflict, and then the elevation of self. So let me put it into some practical terms for you. If you feel this desire to look at pornography creep into your mind, and you stop to consider what actions would ensue if you followed that desire, you should come to the conclusion that you'll end up in sexual immorality, impurity, and sensuality. That is a desire of the flesh. If you have a desire to set up trinkets in your home that represent deities other than Yahweh, and then you pray to them for sustenance and well-being, that will lead you into demon worship and witchcraft. That is a desire of the flesh. If someone cuts me off in traffic and I have a desire to flip them the bird or pull up next to them and let them know everything that they did wrong, that will likely lead me into sinful conflict. And that is a desire of the flesh. Or if you have a desire to cut down one of your coworkers to the boss because you think it will move you up the chain quicker, that will certainly end up presenting as selfish ambition, and that would also be a desire of the flesh. So you can see the desires of the flesh are just desires. They are a result of our fallen bodies, but they are not sin in and of themselves. The sin occurs when you indulge those desires rather than putting them to death. The sin occurs when the desires cross into action. So the desires of the flesh will always be present. What matters is, do you allow those desires of the flesh to blossom into the deeds of the flesh that we found listed here? And for the person without Christ, this is all they really know. Most of their actions will fall into one of these 4 categories because their dead, myopic souls are confirming these desires rather than fighting against them. And while it may not always look like it outwardly, it may not always look like a deed of the flesh, if you dig down deep enough, I think that you'll likely find selfish ambition at the core of most of these actions. I mean, even for Christians, we have a hard time doing things that are completely devoid of selfish motivations, and it would be even more so to the person who is without Christ. And then I would always point back to, even if they're able to actually do something selfless, even then, it is only by the common grace of God that it happens. God is glorified in his creation, often despite his creation. But for the believer, Paul says we have a new desire center that acts in opposition to the desires of the flesh. He calls that desire center the Spirit, who has indwelled and sealed our hearts as a result of God's transforming power in us at salvation. And so since we have this new heart infused with the Spirit of God, our souls or our spirits desire holiness and righteousness. And so the believer is in this constant inner battle of desire. Listen, we are capable of having any desire that could lead to an action or a deed of the flesh. The difference is that we are able to actively put those desires to death by acting in the desires of the Spirit. This is so crucial. Thankfully, Paul gives us another list right here in the passage in Galatians 5 that shows the fruit of the Spirit. So once again, these are not desires themselves, but rather the fruit of those desires. This is what your life will look like if you're acting on the desires of the Spirit. Here we go. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Now, these don't fit into neat little categories like the deeds of the flesh did, but they all fit into one category. godliness. And it's important that we realize that desires leading to these actions are always present for the believer. These desires are always there, whether you feel them or not. The Spirit doesn't ever stop producing desire. He doesn't take an hour off while you're driving to work in the morning. Now, listening to, feeling, and recognizing these desires will take some practice, but they are always available to you. And Spirit-initiated desires will always spur you to the fruit of the Spirit. And keep in mind, fruit here is singular. So this is the whole picture of the believer, not just individual traits from which we can, pick and choose. I don't get to say, well, I'm going to be the gentleness guy and I'm going to leave everything else to everyone else. No, I have to exhibit all of these fruit of the Spirit depicted here in Galatians. But even with that said, that doesn't mean that different desires won't make different parts of the fruit of the Spirit more apparent at different times. Now, it's rarely going to be simple, though. At any given moment, we have dozens of desires coursing through our minds. It is no easy thing to slow down enough to decipher them at any given moment. But this is where self-control and sober-mindedness particularly come into play, which I'll do a whole video on soon. But for now, know that we have to be in disciplined control over our minds if we want to navigate our thoughts and our desires well. We have to know what we're thinking before we can control what we're thinking. And beloved, this is a huge key to your battle with sin. Tuck this away somewhere safe and accessible because you're going to need this as a building block for everything else that we have coming. This is a major, major core principle in living a new heart life. That's all I've got for today. I'm typically around for questions, so hit me up in the comments if needed. As always, you can support the show with likes and shares and subscribes and positive reviews. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless.